Hi everybody, Moadim L'Simcha. I'm here at the Beth Leda Sukkah and we are live streaming this class on Ushpizin. Now Ushpizin is an Aramaic word that means guests, and it is a unique feature of Sukkot. Sukkot is, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the main feature of Sukkot, besides this rain stick leaf branch thing right here, is a hut that we all stay in to memorialize either the time that we spent traveling in the desert or the clouds of protection that God had dwell amongst us as we traveled through the desert. So either a supernatural or a natural means of protection while we were in a vulnerable space. But during this year, the time of coronavirus, the aspect of Sukkot, which I think a lot of people are very attached to and which really is central to the nature of the holiday, namely to invite people in to this space, to share this indoor-outdoor space together, is obviously a lot more complicated. So we've had to keep our distance in this time. So the aspect of Sukkot, which emphasizes hospitality, has been interrupted. So I thought a way to bring us into this space was to have this class in our beautiful Beth Leda Sukkah, and we could virtually share this space together as we learn a little bit about this, the aspect of hospitality in Sukkot, namely the practice of Ushpizin. Now, Ushpizin, just a quick overview, which we'll get to in the texts in a little bit, is the practice or the ritual of inviting in the spiritual presences of the seven main characters of the Bible: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, David, and Joseph. And but also those represent different aspects of God in Jewish mysticism, the sphirot, the different aspects of God's metaphysical personality. So we're going to talk about those dual aspects as we move through the texts. But first, I just want to focus actually on a really beautiful Talmudic text that focuses on the importance of hospitality, how important hospitality is. So in Shabbat 127a, it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Gdola hachnasat orchim hashkamat beit hamidrash, tikatani mipnei haorchim umipnei bittul beit hamidrash. So Rabbi Yochanan says, inviting in guests is just as important as the yeshiva buchers who get up in the morning to steig in the gemuras in the Beis Midrash. So hospitality is just as important as Talmud Torah. And as we know, and the Talmud says otherwise, Talmud Torah is keneged kol mitzvos, right? Talmud Torah is as important as all of the other mitzvahs. So hospitality is so important that it even defers, it pushes off this mitzvah, because as we see, it's yoter mehashkama beit hamidrash, says Rabbi Dimi min Nahardea, dikatani mipnei haorchim v'hadar umipnei bittul beit midrash. Since hospitality is mentioned first in the Talmud, it's actually seen as being even more important than learning Torah. Namely, how does this play out practically? That you're allowed to move the Torah like tables, the benches on which the students would study, so that you can invite in guests. So hospitality is actually doche Talmud Torah, according to this perspective. And why is that? Because Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Gdola hachnasat orchin me hakbalat pnei hashchina. Inviting in human guests is even more important than inviting in the divine guest of the Shekhinah. That's an astounding, a radical claim he's making, that the mitzvah of hospitality, of taking care of people who need your help when they're traveling and they don't have their normal resources to avail themselves of, is even more important in a sense than Judaism. It's more important than like spirituality and inviting the Kadosh Baruch Hu, inviting God into your space. First of all, God is everywhere. So the notion that God needs to be specially invited in is like already theologically a little bit problematic. But when it comes to what it means to make priorities, what it means to make choices, it's more important to ensure that hospitality takes place, that guests who need a place to stay and need their shelter under which to take refuge, that is actually more important than, let's say, making sure you get a minyan or making sure that tefillah, that prayer, starts on time or something like that, right? That hospitality is actually doche mitzvahs in the Torah. It's a pretty incredible point. It says, Amar Rebbe Elazar. How, this seems like especially weird, because why is it that a religious leader would say, listen, what's more important to God? More important than God, the thing that my profession is based on. What's more important is people. Why? Says Rebbe Elazar, because you are missing the point of God. If you think God needs to be specially taken care of, then you miss how God is actually a space that includes us. We don't need to include God in our space because God is hamakom. He says, Bo ur'eh shelo k'midat HaKadosh Baruch Hu midat basar v'dam. This is a classic rabbinic analogy. It says, come and see. God is nothing like people. And here's how. Here's like a negative analogy. Midat basar v'dam. Ein katan yachol lomar lagadol hamtein ad shavo etzlecha. Someone of lesser stature would never say to like a muckety muck, right? You don't like tell, Justin Trudeau, like, listen, 1 second, buddy, I'll get to you soon. I got to go finish taking care of this first. You don't do that. You like, whoa, oh God, it's the prime minister. I got to take care of all this stuff. But but God, when God was coming to visit Abraham, right? When we see the angels come visit Abraham, Abraham says first, wait a second, God, I'll get to you in a minute. First, I need to go take care of these guests. And God seems to be fine with that. So God is obviously like of a stature that can't even be compared to anything else. And what makes God so great is not that God insists on being treated special. What makes God amazing, what makes God unique, is that God does not insist on anything because God can't be hurt in that way. So the notion that we need to take a special care of God's feelings or something like that misses the point that God is this radicalizing empowerment to encourage us to do what we need to do. Not to, in a sense, take care of our own spiritual needs, but that our spirituality should be orienting us towards taking care of other people. And that's what Rebbe Elazar seems to be saying. Okay, so who are these Ushpizin? Right, so it seems like hospitality is essential to Sukkot, but we have this balance between human hospitality, right, inviting people into your sukkah in normal times, and the spiritual hospitality in which we invite, again, the spirits of our ancestors, we invite the aspects of God into our sukkah. How are these things balanced? Because it seems like, according to this Gemara, there's some tension there. So when one conflicts with the other, how do we weigh that out? What's the stira? What's the chras? Right? What's the pshara, as they say? What's the not compromise, but how do you weigh this out, right? How do you suss it out? Okay. So who are these Ushpizin? Now it says in the Zohar, come and see. I'm not going to do it in the Aramaic, sorry. Come and see. When a person sits in this dwelling, namely the sukkah, under the shade of faith, which is what the Zohar likes to call schach, but also referring to, in a sense, sitting under the presence of God, emphasizing the way in which the schach represents the ananei hakavod, the cloud of protection that God had to dwell amongst us. The Shekhinah spreads her wings over you from above. So what is it to be in the sukkah? To be in the sukkah is, in a sense, to be under the wings of the Shekhinah. And Avram Avinu, right? Avram, our ancestor, and 5 other tzaddikim come and dwell with you. Now, quick thing. So wait, that only seems like it's 6. Don't we have 7 nights of Sukkot? Aren't there 7 tzaddikim? Aren't there 7 Ushpizin? And the answer is yes, but the Shekhinah is actually one of them. So there's Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Yosef, corresponding to Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Chod, and Yesod. And the Shekhinah corresponds to Malchus, and Malchus also corresponds to David. Why? Because David HaMelech, the king David. Malchus means kingdom, kingship. So David is associated with the Shekhinah. Great. So Rabbi Abba says, Avram, the 5 other tzaddikim, and King David, there we go, join to dwell with you. As it is written, dwell in Sukkot 7 days. 7 days is written, not for 7 days. Now here's a quick little Zohar point. Yamaya, right, days in Aramaic refers to not just days, but also the primordial days of creation, and also corresponding to the 7 lower sphirot, namely the ones I just mentioned, which also correlate to the Ushpizin. So actually the Zohar almost never uses the phrase sphirot or sephirin. It almost always uses days or midot, characteristics, language like that. It's always what's called, in that fancy language, circumlocuting. It's always talking around it. It never wants to be direct because it's something that's too big and too holy to speak about in such a paltry way. Okay. And it is always also written, 6 days did God create the heavens. So there we go. We have this correlation between the Sefirot, between the Ushpizin, between the days, the primordial days, which are the building block of creation. A person should celebrate each day with a shining face, anpin nehirin, with these guests, the Ushpizin, who come to dwell with you. A really interesting point, actually, is that Yontif, right, holidays and Shabbos are different things, they're different inyanim. But Sukkot and Shabbos have especially more closeness and a little bit more relationality to them. And you see that actually with the anpin nehirin, that language of shining face is also the language used to refer to the way that like Shabbos like changes our comportment, it changes our way of existing. You have what's called panin chadatin, you have these new face. But this notion of like having a shining face, it also is language that we see referring to a bride and a bridegroom, or two people who are getting married. And Sukkot is, the shade of faith is also compared to a chuppah. And the sukkah is also supposed to hint at the sukkah to come, or the chuppah to come, when in the times of Mashiach. Okay, so we have like kind of a basic overview of when we say the Ushpizin, who do we mean? We mean these characters from the Bible, but we also mean these 7 different aspects of God, stretching from God's love and God's kindness all the way down to Malchus, or the Shekhinah, which is the aspect of God that is made manifest in this world, right? From the transcendent, right, the distant, to the intimate, to the proximate, to the close, to the imminent. Okay, so I want to also introduce you to the text that's used in inviting the Ushpizin into our sukkah. And here I'm going to use the flip camera feature. Look how clever I am. Okay, so it says, consider Ashkenaz and the Ashkenazic Nusach. Here's one of the classic renditions of this. Tivu tivu Ushpizin ilain. Tivu tivu Ushpizin kadishin. Tivu tivu Ushpizin demehem nuta. Come sit, lofty guests. Come sit, holy guests. Come sit, guests of faith. And when the Zohar talks about faith, what it's referring to is the aspects of God's being. Zakah chukeon Yisrael dechtiv ki chelek Hashem amo Yaakov chevel nachlato. The portion of Israel is worthy, it's rare, it's pure, it's rarefied, as it said, because God is the portion of God's people. Jacob, right, is inheriting God. So when it says chelek Hashem amo, it's not just like God's portion, like God's being generous and giving us stuff. The idea actually is that God's self, is our portion. Really powerful and beautiful idea. It says, Yiratzon fanecha Hashem Elokai v'Elokei avosai, shetishresh hinascha beinenu v'tifros aleinu sukat shlemecha. May the Shekhinah come and dwell amidst us, spreading over us her sukkah of peace. Ulahaki fotam miziv kvodecha akadosh v'ator natui or Hashem yolamala kidnesher ya'ir kino. Surround them, i.e. us, with the radiance of your holy and pure glory, spread over their heads above, like an eagle protecting its nest. Like an eagle protecting its nest, i.e. like an eagle hovering over the nest, sheltering it with its wings. And from there, may the flow of life flow to your servant. Misham yushpa shefa chayim lovdecha. Really beautiful and powerful image that the sukkah is kind of a paradoxical thing. And this is actually something we're going to talk about in Thursday's class. The sukkah is both a space of exposure, right? We need to be able to see the sky and the roof. The walls are often open. We're outside, starting to get a little bit nippy. I'm wearing my scarf and my jacket. But on the other hand, we have this experience of being sheltered. We have this experience of being watched over and cared for. And that really is this beautiful dialectic of sukkah, that after we've gone through the intense process of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, stripping ourselves down to the nub, right? Stripping ourselves down to our basic core. From there, we're left with the question, and what are you going to do with yourself? Are you going to pour yourself back into it, or are you going to be like, okay, I did it, I'm done? And Sukkot is this really incredible challenge to put yourself in a not an easy situation, right? Eating outside, learning outside, spending time in the Sukkah as much as you can. But the point, though, is to show, as it says, it's a shelter of faith. God's faith in terms of God's dwelling here with us, God's sheltering us, but also our faith in terms of our mesiras nefesh, right? Our pouring ourselves back into this. And as we pour ourselves into it, so God will pour God's self into us. Okay. So I'll say, here's another text from the Zohar, and it also gets at this dialectic, this tension between human hospitality and divine hospitality. So we have this ritual of inviting God into the Sukkah through these Ushpizin, through the 7 different aspects of God's personality and the 7 different characters from the Torah. But what about the aspect of human hospitality, which according to the Gemara, displaces this kind of even inviting God in? So we see, Rabbi Abba said, it is written, you will dwell in Sukkot 7 days. Remember, 7 days, 7 sfirot, right? 7 Ushpizin. And then later it says, they will dwell in Sukkot. First you, and then they. Why? Right? So we have 2 different psukim, we have 2 different verses. One says you will dwell in Sukkot 7 days. The other one says they will dwell in Sukkot 7 days. Why is it changed from the second person to the third person? The first verse refers to the Ushpizin, 7 days. And the second refers to the residents of the world, B'nai Almaya. Okay. So we have a verse that justifies both the spiritual hospitality of inviting in the Ushpizin and the human hospitality of inviting in the those who need shelter. Great. So in a world in which it is not safe to be packing people into the Sukkah like we love to. Right, last year, our Simchat Beit Shueva, Beth Lida, was like crammed full of people. We have bonfire, just like tons of people crammed in the Sukkah. Incredible experience. And that's why it's so important that we observe the safety guidelines so we can get back to that safely as soon as possible. We want to have our full Sukkah again. But right now, we have to fill it up in different kinds of ways. So what are the ways then in which we're able to fill up our Sukkah with guests? So the Ushpizin, I think, provides us with the 2 models. And we saw them before as like kind of conflicting, but I actually want to say that they're cooperating. They're collaborating. One model of inviting guests into your Sukkah is spiritual. And that's the classic Ushpizin model of what does it mean to bring in the spiritual aspects of God. But the second aspect is still human, but still distant at the same time. And when we get to that, I'll show you how. So, okay. So the first text I want to bring in is from a modern Hasidic rabbi from the 20th century. He lived in Bnei Brak in Israel, named Shalom Noach Berezovsky, also known as the Netivot Shalom. You know, it's a Hasidic book because there's always some kind of pun, usually involving the name. So his name is Shalom Noach, so he called his book Netivot Shalom. Shalom, Nun, Nun, Shalom. Good, okay. So he has a 2-volume set, and the first volume is kind of like his theory of Hasidism, and the second volume is all about the holidays of Shabbos. So really, really beautiful essays, really lucidly written and very like modern Hebrew. So people looking for like an introductory text to get into Hasidus, I often recommend Netivot Shalom because it is much less, it is much more kind of fully written out and more kind of, it's more pellucidly written. Okay. So in his essay, Inyan HaUshpizin Kadishin, the idea of the holy guests, he writes, this is the idea of the Ushpizin. The 7 shepherds who initiated repair in this world. Now, another language for these people are shepherds. Why? Because actually every single hero in the Bible is a shepherd. Isn't that interesting? Every single person of significance in the Torah is a shepherd. From Avram to Yitzchak to Yaakov, all the way to Moses, remember, shepherding in the desert, all the way to David, the little shepherd boy, right? Playing on his flute and playing with his slingshot. Who's the only farmer in the Bible? Cain, right? The conflict between Cain and Abel is between shepherds and agrarians and farmers. I mean, some like people, scholars of the Bible have written about maybe this like an ancient conflict between 2 different ways of using the land. You know, like shepherds graze land, so they move along it, whereas farmers work a certain amount of land, so they have to stay on it. So there's a conflict of interest there. But there's something special about shepherding in the Torah. Not just, I think, from an economic perspective, but also, I think, from a spiritual perspective. Now, in Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, we saw this language of kivakoras roya edro, right? That we are like God's flock, and God is paying attention to every single one of us, and we are counted and we are accounted for. A shepherd has to be paying attention to its flock. That is what's different about shepherding. Now, farming, anyone who has a garden or something like that knows, actually, there's also a practice of attention as well, right? What it means to cultivate and tend a garden, right? As Voltaire said, we must all cultivate our gardens. However, there's another level here, because shepherds have to care for living creatures. Shepherds have to care for animals which wander around and have their own wills. Farming, it's very difficult, it's challenging, but plants don't just like pick up and move. So there's a different kind of practice of attention. So the 7 shepherds, I think it's important that they're shepherds here, because it's an image of care. At the time when there is renewal in creation and protection from above descends on each Jew, when one dwells in the Sukkah and the Holy Blessed One with dignity spreads the divine canopy over us, like an eagle hovering over its nest and its chicks, like a mother protecting her children. Along with all of this, the world of repair is renewed by the 7 shepherds who are the holy Ushpizin, continuing the repair of all the aspects of the universe. Now, what he's referring to is that Rosh Hashanah is not just an arbitrary calendrical date, according to Siva Shalom and Jewish mysticism. Rather, Rosh Hashanah is the renewal of creation. It is dipping all the way back into the primordial moments of when the universe emerged, yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, or something from the depths of God's being. Something being there when there wasn't anything there before. In the sense, the universe is not just continuing, the universe is renewed. Every Rosh Hashanah, we reactivate that aspect of newness, of something coming that there wasn't there before. And on Yom Kippur, that redounds on a personal level, because it's not just that you continue from one day to another, but you are renewed. Or Yom Kippur, we are renewed as people. Rosh Hashanah renews the entirety of the world. In Yom Kippur, we are renewed as people, and we're like, says, a Bria Chadasha. We're like a new creature. We're born again, as it were. And because of that, then, there's a break, right? Judaism is, I think a lot of people associate Judaism with nostalgia, right? But that has more to do with popular culture. I think the religion of Judaism is very attentive to the past, but in a way that brings it into the future, right? It's very futurally oriented, because the newness that we're talking about means that your past does not define or control or condemn you. The future invites you to bring your past into it, but to bring your past into it in a way in which you can transform it through tshuva. Sukkot is a continuation of this process of renewal. So it says, as it is in this general, so is it in particular. So as it is in a theoretical sense, so is it actually actively. Every aspect of the renewal of creation is also relevant for the individual, to each and every Jew every year during the season. Our dwelling in the Sukkah immediately follows the high holy days. Sukkot, listen, working as a rabbi, Tishrei is bonkers. It's like holiday. It's you can't get a break. But I mean, it's a marathon full of sprints, and it's an incredible spiritual experience, this suffusion of holiness into time. But it's so important that Sukkot can only follow Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It has to follow Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, because we need to be renewed to be able to do this, right? The world of repair is reinitiated for each Jew. Olam HaTikun. The world doesn't just keep on plugging along, but what it means for it to continue is to repair and to heal, right? It's like a human body, something I think we're all very attentive to right now. What it means for a human body to move forward, especially after, let's say, it is struck with an illness, is it doesn't just the body has the ability to heal. It knits itself back together, right? Similarly, the world is knitting itself back together, and we are those white blood cells, right? We are those immunity cells in our body that are able to enact this process of healing. So when the world of repair provides for one of the spiritual potencies, the sphirot of each of the 7 shepherds, who help anyone who comes to cleanse themselves to manifest the world of repair anew. So then what is it then to do Ushpizin according to Shalom Noach Berezovsky, to the Nesilas Shalom? What it is to do Ushpizin is not just to welcome in these random ancestors, but actually to welcome in different aspects of God, and not just into your space, but into yourself. It's kind of similar to Sfirat Omer. Sukkot, each of the 7 days of Sukkot corresponds to one of the 7 Sfirot, and so does Sfirat Omer. And each day then is an opportunity to bring that energy of God's love, bring that energy of God's strength, bring the energy of God's balance and beauty, bring the energy of God's victorious energy, bring the energy of God's glory and dignity, and humility, bring the energy of God's foundation, of God's solidity, of God's sense of emplacement, and finally bring the aspect of God's manifestation, right? The malchus of the Shekhinah, God's intimate closeness. How do we actually not just touch those or experience like the edge of them, the hem of them, touch the hem of their garment, but how do we actually bring them into ourselves as aspects of our own development, aspects of our own self-transformation, aspects of our own progression as people, as spiritual creatures, as psychological creatures, as emotional creatures, right? How are we actually able then each night of Sukkot to bring in those energies and to fill our Sukkah with that spirit? So how do we then practice that? Again, we won't be able to have as many human guests or any human guests maybe this year, but we can bring in a divine guest maybe every night of Sukkot. So this night of Sukkot is going to be the 4th night of Sukkot, which corresponds to Netzach and to Moshe. So what aspects of Moshe can we bring into our Sukkah? What aspects of Moshe can we start to work on in ourselves? Moses' humility, right? Moses' leadership, Moses' vision, Moses' resilience. And Netzach is God's kind of expansive energy, the energy of God that's able to come into this world, but in a way that is flowing outwards, right? So what expansive aspects can we bring into our lives? That's just an example of what it means to do that kind of work each day, that each day becomes an aspect of psychological, emotional, and spiritual development, to invite those aspects of God into yourself. What does it mean to then continue the work that you initiated Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur into Sukkot in this joyous and celebratory and expansive way? Okay. So that is a spiritual take on how to have hospitality in a time of distance. Here is an alternative model that I think touches on the human guests that the Gemara and the Zohar mentioned. But again, how do we have human guests during coronavirus? The answer is we might not be able to invite them in now, but there is still a human aspect that cannot be ignored. So the Pri-Eitz Chaim was a text written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was a student of Isaac Luria. It is the aspect of his writing, of this recension of his writings, that's focused on the practical ritual aspects of religion, the mitzvahs, right? The Eitz Chaim is like his book of theoretical, like metaphysics, is talking about theory of cosmology and things like that, and the theoretical aspects of Kabbalah. The Pri-Eitz Chaim is more practical. So how do we actually bring these theoretical things into the way that we practice Judaism? How do we practice the Torah mitzvahs? Okay. So it's actually, this isn't even from Chaim Vital, it's actually from Yaakov Tzemach, who's an editor of the 3rd edition of this text. Another important Kabbalist from the 17th century. Don't yell at me if I was wrong. Okay. So Yaakov Tzemach said that Chaim Vital would do this. Okay, so we have a report about Chaim Vital. He said he would distribute allocated funds to the poor. What would he do right before Sukkot? He would give tzedakah. Why? Because he said tzedakah was most effective Erev Sukkot. Now why? Because it's then that our matriarch, Rachel, who is associated with the Shekhinah, is called tzedek and ascends in a place of tzedakah. Now this is a very complicated thing in the Sfirot. It's not worth getting into in this moment. The point though is that the aspect of Shekhinah is ascending, arising, and touching the aspect of God which is associated with tzedek, which is Yesod. So the flow of God's shefa, the flow of God's energy is coming into the universe through Shekhinah, and Shekhinah is like full of generosity and energy. That's right, Erev Sukkot, right after Yom Kippur, right after there was this holy union within the highest aspects of God, and the renewal of creation has been reinitiated. That energy and that blessing starts to flow into this world. So he says, we take care during Sukkot to only speak words of Torah in the Sukkah, since the holiness of this mitzvah is so great. The proof is that we are not allowed to derive personal benefit from the materials of the Sukkah. Now that's a halachic issue, that you're not allowed on Shabbos and Yom Tov to like take a twig out of the schach or take like a stick out of the wall of your Sukkah and like use it to pick your teeth. The point is that you can't, once the Sukkah is built, you cannot benefit from it personally. The only way you're allowed to benefit from it is to enjoy it as a holy space. So the Sukkah is a space of holiness. That's why actually some people, when they're in the Sukkah, dress up very nice, right? Even on Chol HaMoed, they'll still like wear a nice suit in Sukkah because it's a space of dignity. And we protect our language, right? We only speak words of kindness. We only speak words of Torah. We only speak words of holiness. Okay. And the poor, he says, should be of those who eat from our table. For the portion of the Ushpizin must be given to the poor. The desire of the righteous is that the poor eat their portion. Okay. What? Wait a second. There is a model of spirituality, which Judaism, in my opinion, steadfastly and forthrightly refuses. I think it's a model of spirituality that's very popular right now, in which spirituality is about experience. It's about experiencing God. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all about spirituality. I'm all about mysticism, da-da-da-da-da. But I'm about it because Judaism, Kabbalah, Hasidus, etc., refuses to see experience as strictly being something of the self. Experience is always attached to the way that we are in the world, the way that we act, the way that we behave, and the way that we enact the Torah, the way that we enact the mitzvahs. It's never detached from that. It's never just about blissing out, right, and like tripping out on God on a mountaintop somewhere. Yes, we do that too, and we should all have that experience. But what does it mean to be isolated right now? It's not just to have the Netivot Shalom version of a spiritual Ushpizin in which you invite in God's energy and God's energy comes and dwells in you. But for God's energy to come and dwell in you, according to Rabbi Chaim Vital, according to the Pri Etz Chaim, you need to also be attentive to the poor. What does it mean to have the Ushpizin come into your home? It means that a portion of what you would be giving otherwise needs to be going to those who need it. Now, this is a kind of a quick report, but it is explicit. It is mefayrash. It is explicit in the Zohar. And that is what's going on. It says, and right after the classic description of the Ushpizin that we started reading before in the Zohar, it says, Uvay lemechte lemiskene, and one must celebrate with the poor. What's the reason? Because the portion of the Ushpizin belongs to the poor. The notion isn't that, Sukkot is a very materialistic holiday, and I think that's actually really incredible that we spend. Some people spend like hundreds of dollars buying the most beautiful esrog possible, the beautiful esrog they've ever seen in their own entire lives, right? We see the movie Ushpizin, right? They're always looking for the beautiful esrog, and it's a beautiful thing. It's what's called hidur mitzvah, devoting our energy towards beautifying the Torah and mitzvahs. I think a lot of people who have experienced the Jewish religion haven't experienced it in such an aesthetic way. There is a beautiful aesthetic quality to Judaism, which is really, really important. Our pouring our resources and our energy and our attention and our love and care into the mitzvah so that we get pleasure from them. That's super important. But we cannot let that attention to the physical, the material aspect of the mitzvahs strictly be about our own pleasure. It needs to also be about ensuring that other people in our community, other people in our city, other people in our country, other people in our province, etc., are able to experience that leisure and that delight and that pleasure as well. The portion of the Ushpizin belongs to the poor. And one who sits under the shade of faith and invites these supernal guests, the guests of faith, the Ushpizin, but does not give the poor their portion, the Ushpizin don't come to visit. What do they say? They say, don't eat the bread of this Scrooge McDuck. Do not eat the bread of this miser. They actually quote Mishlei, Al tilcham es lechem ra'ain. Don't eat the bread of this person with a wicked eye, this person who is so concerned with their own pleasure and their own experience that they're not able to be generous. They're not able to have an ayin tov, right? A generous eye. The table one prepares is for oneself, not for the Holy One. Woe to the one from whose table the Ushpizin keep their distance. says later in this text, it says, a person should not say, I'll eat and be satisfied and be saturated, and then whatever I have left, I'll give to the poor. No, rather, the first portion belongs to the guests. And that's actually true according to halacha. If you have guests in your home, God willing, we'll have guests soon, you need to make sure that they eat well first. Torah says, be a generous and good host. And if you delight them and satisfy them, then God will come and celebrate with you. So then how are we able to have hospitality during Sukkot when we can't invite physical, actual people into our Sukkah with us? The answer is, we make sure that people in our community can eat who wouldn't be able to eat otherwise. And if that happens, if we do that, by being generous the way God wants us to be, then God will come and hang out with us in our Sukkah. How do we have guests during coronavirus? We make sure that the homeless, the poor, and the starving have what they need to be able to have pleasure, to be able to have a good filling meal, to go out, buy someone a cup of soup, to go out, find a sandwich to be able to give to somebody. Make sure that they have what they need to eat. Especially in time of a public health crisis like this, homelessness and hunger are two immensely important things to be paying attention to, because they increase the chance of spreading this disease, but also it means that people will be far more immunocompromised and far more susceptible to having infection. The way to bring God into our homes, and the way to bring God into our sukkahs, the way to have a guest during sukkahs, is to give tzedakah. It's to go out and find people who need help and give them their portion, because they own it, because God's portion is theirs. What it means to be a person, a Jew of God, is to be attentive to those who need it, because that is God's portion. Chelek Hashem Amo. God's portion is God's people. We are those helping hands in this world, distributing God's wealth, distributing God's sustenance to all those who need it. Because the portion of the Ushpizin belongs to the poor. I want to end with this beautiful, beautiful text from the Mishnah Torah, from the Rambam's law code, in his laws of holiday leisure. But before I do that, I just want to wrap up and just kind of summarize and say, okay, we saw a text in the Gemara in which it says that hospitality is actually more important than inviting in the presence of God. And that is seeming a daring and a radical statement. But we see that in Jewish practice, right, in observing Torah and mitzvahs, in keeping sukkahs, it is actually playing out that way exactly. And Nesivos Shalom has a spiritual take on Ushpizin, that it's continuing the process of introspection and self-development and transformation of Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, to invite these aspects of God into ourselves, to work on these aspects of ourselves that correlate to God's personality, God's sefirot. And that is absolutely true. The way that we access those spiritual aspects, according to Chaim Vital, according to the Zohar, according to the Gemara, I would say, and as we're seeing in a moment, according to the Rambam, is to make sure that we do not lose or forget our attention to people. We do not forget that the people who are in need are those with whom we must celebrate. How can we bring Simchas Yontif, Zman Simchasenu, right? The time of our joy. How can we bring the joy of the festival to those who need joy the most? That is the question we need to ask ourselves each and every day of Sukkot. How can we bring holiness, pleasure, and leisure, and sustenance to those who need it? The major holidays all have a charitable aspect to them. And this is the aspect of Sukkot, which is, I think, the most intensive, but that's the one that's often ignored. We often just have the parties, we have our Simchas Beis Shoevas, and maybe in a way, this is not a good circumstance we're in, but maybe the circumstance we're living in now can bring our attention back to our interconnectedness with our community, to those who need help the most, making sure that we see that that interconnectedness with other people is also our interconnectedness with God. The way to bring God into our life, the way to literally bring God into our sukkah, the way to bring God's presence into our sukkah is to make sure that the poor are taken care of. Beautiful passage from the Rambam with which we'll close. Ketzad, how do we manifest simcha, joy, on a holiday? It says, Haktanim, noten lahem klayot ve'egozim migdanot. You give poor, you give children like nuts and treats and candy. You give your loved ones gifts. You give them like beautiful clothes to wear. You give them a nice little, treat and a special thing for Yontif. And you eat meat and wine if you are a carnivore, or you eat seitan and, I don't know, drink a really nice beer if you don't eat meat and you don't drink wine or what have you, right? You eat really nice, delicious, delectable food. Uchshehu ochel v'shoteh chayav la'achil lager layatom v'lam'almana im sha'ar aniyim umlalim. And when you are eating, you need to make sure that the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the immigrant, the refugee, amongst all the other poor, are able to eat as well. Aval mi shenoel daltot chatzero v'ochel v'shoteh hu v'anav v'yishto ve'eno ma'achil mashkel aniyim mari nefesh ein zo simchas mitzvah ela simchat kreso. But someone who locks the gates and doesn't make sure that the poor are taken care of and just feeds their family, just feeds themselves and their family, does not really have the joy of the holiday, but rather only has the joy of their tummy. Stark words, but a beautiful passage. The way to be the most full and the most satiated and the most satisfied isn't to stuff your stomach. It's to fill yourself up with love and generosity. To give to other people will be the most satisfying experience. That's how you have joy in this world, is you make sure other people have joy as well. And that invites God in. That opens up the space for God to come dwell with you. I wish us all Zman Simchaseinu Mamish, a true time of joy and a time of true joy, a time of generosity, a time of loving attention, and a time of making sure that those who need care receive it. May we all have Moedim L'Simcha, an important, special time for joy.